I looked at some of the information on the how do you pronounce it? Something or other Tov, Ka-26. Like I say, I was the one LS that actually produced it with the Renault manufacturing company, basically. Originally, we were messing around with it with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine or like a V8 style type engine or some sort of engine like that. I don't think it wasn't initially done with the air-cooled engine. The air-cooled engines had a problem with overheating. They've always had a problem with overheating. Every Lycoming engine that was ever produced had a problem with overheating. You idle them for 30 minutes on the ground and they'll basically overheat. It was one of the big major problems of all the aircraft. They couldn't start up the engine until they're about ready to take off because there wasn't enough air moving past. The only time that the air cooled engines actually were able to cool themselves enough was basically at flight, pretty much. So as soon as you landed, you had to taxi over to where you're going to park it, and you had to shut them off, basically, because they didn't. They, with the oil cooler, they could cool themselves a little bit more, and it gave people a little bit more standby time. So the air cooled engines were basically a real problem, and that's one of the reasons why they called them the Banshee and stuff like that with the Kamov 26 or whatever that series of helicopter. Like I say, initially it was done in about 1920 or so. That's when it first came out, and then when we first were messing around with them, and like I said, we did more of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine style engine pods, and messed around with that. But they were a little bit heavy, and my engineers said that they could put a big fan in front of the engine and blow air past the engines, and that could cool it down enough. And they think that they could get the amount of power. The problem, low horsepower air cooled engines work just fine. You can do low horsepower, but when you want to pump it up to like a couple thousand horsepower or 800 horsepower, when you really want to start pushing those maximums, it has to do with the thickness of the aluminum or the way the heat transfers out. You really can't cool it. It has to do with how quickly the sidewall of the aluminum. I'm not an expert on this, but basically I am LS Lucifer Star, also known as Brian. So anyway, and I was the one who offered all this stuff. Um, anyway, so when they were doing it, and we were thinking about, because the engines on the side pods are kind of a problem, because you have to do all these, you have to do like a 90-degree bend, and then it goes in, and then you got to do a thingy, and then a ring gear or whatever, and there's a problem of basically, I forget what it was. Whenever you have a gear, pressing on a gear, it wants to push out on you. So, and I think what we were trying, we messed around with doing two ring gears, one for the top impeller, one for the bottom impeller. I think I forget exactly how does it work. Anyway, there's a couple different ways we were thinking about doing it, because when you're doing really high horsepower on a shaft, you can't really go onto something because it always wants to kick out on you. It's hard to get those gears to lock in, and so it's actually pushing the gear because it would rather slip and go down. It really, it just puts because all that pressure is being put on on that bearing and trying to throw it down and out. Anyway, and I think we actually went with a dual ring maybe with that one. Anyway, though, it was in trials for a long time, and it took a long time to actually produce it. And initially, when we came out with it, the steel wasn't good enough in the helicopters for those called. We weren't using titanium; we were using a steel ring gears, and they weren't quite good enough, and they would strip out in about 6 months or a year. And anyway, we decided basically just don't worry about it. We'll just go ahead and produce it or put it out there and do it for test flights, and we'll because it showed in prolonged use it would start to wear and strip out, which could cause a crash. So we went ahead and released it, of course, and basically figured we would keep working on the metallurgy to get it up to snuff, as they say, or get it up to good enough. So anyway, We produced them, or we're producing them, and mostly for our people or certain people, and I think we did open it up to the initial market. Like I said, we tried the Lycomings, and then we went with the air cooled eventually. I think there were some produced with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, or more of a V8 style engine. And we were also thinking about going underneath and doing two engines underneath, you know. But the thing is that that meant that there would be these great big engines right behind the person, and there's also the problem of the oil, you know, with the engines. Although with Lycomings, that's not really a problem. Anyway, though, it was first produced in 1920, and probably they started working on it so around 1910 or 1915, I guess, and then around not much happened until about 1920. Because I know because they hit the market about 1930, 1940. That's when they were starting to be sold. And by then we had gone, I believe, with the air cooled and everything else. They'd already gone through trials and gone through everything, and it was we had the steel, we had everything, and it was being sold. So in 1940, it was being sold with a car. You could have it in three different options. You could have the car that you drive in the back, or you could have the pod on it, and a detachable pod, or it could just be enclosed, basically. And the pod hung on with like 4 pins or something like that, and then dropped down if you wanted. So you could also use it for dual use or whatever. You know, also even put a hook on it. I think we offered too, because we try and do multi-use with Renault or LS stuff. My stuff is always multi-use. So, because, I mean, not everyone wants to drive a car, when they get there. But basically, it's basically you fly to somewhere, you land, and then you can drive your car or truck some places, and then you get back on and fly away. Or you can take kids and go camping and use it as a camping thing. Giving to the civilian market or selling on the civilian market is always a challenge. You never know if you spent. I mean, I spent a lot of money on this thing. It was very expensive, but it was safe, and it was a good helicopter and fairly reliable. It was finally up to the point. Like I said, Renault, LS stuff, Titanic style stuff. It's always reliable. It's always built to last, and it's always top best quality. So anyway, I produced those helicopters, and I put them for sale, and they were also sold with the possibility of a car. Like if you bought it, you could get a car basically, or a car modification for it. Anyway, it was updated in 1969. It was not first produced in 1969. Basically, it was a little bit older style. They had the older style gauges and stuff like that, and there was some reliability problems and some other stuff. So I think they reworked the metallurgy and did some other tweaking to it in 1969, and that's when they produced it. And it was sold for a couple of years. They actually made quite a few of those. There was a lot of them back in the day. I mean, a lot of people had them. Like I said, they hit the market at about $12 to $18,000. They made a really small one. It was just like a single seater or a two seater or something like that. And then they made the bigger ones with the bigger engines and all that. Like I said, it was the aircraft that was in competition with the little single, them from MASH, and basically those little like bubble top helicopters, pretty much with the gas tank on the side, and it's really ugly. Those things are really cheap, and it uses like the spar or whatever, tubular design drive shaft to the back things. Those things were I think those things were about $5,000 to $8,000 for one of those, or $12,000 was the top end of those things, but pretty much. They were really, really, really cheap because they used a normal gas engine, just high performance, and we produced those as well. I produced them in a couple different places. That was one design that I had, but I didn't really like that one because, I mean, it's easy and cheap to produce, but it didn't have much power, and tests of it show that although it could carry two people, although it could carry three people, it couldn't carry them that well. It was used a lot for medical stuff and some other stuff, but realistically it sucked, and it was just a cheap helicopter, and nobody really wanted it or bought it.